Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Climate Security Podcast hosted by the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. I'm your host, Michael Thomas, and I'm thrilled to kick off this exciting series dedicated to exploring the complex relationship between climate change and security. As we delve into the intersection of these two critical global issues, we will engage in thought-provoking conversations with leading experts, policymakers and practitioners right across Australia and around the world. In this first episode, I warmly welcome Dr. Al Palazzo. Al is an adjunct professor in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales, Canberra. Previously, he was the long-serving Director of War Studies in the Australian Army Research Centre, a part of the Future Land Warfare Branch in Army Headquarters. Al has published widely on Australian military history as well as the future character of war. Amongst his many books are The Australian Army, A History of Its Organisation, The Battle of Crete, and Planning to Not Lose, the Australian Army's New Philosophy of War. Of particular relevance to today's conversation, Al recently published Climate Change and National Security, the Implications for the Military, and this was published by the US Army. Al, a warm welcome to the Climate Security Podcast, no pun intended.
Yes, well, thank you, Michael. I'm very pleased to be here.
Great. Al, I just wanted to start our conversation this afternoon. If you could tell us a little bit about your background, particularly in the Australian military, and I suppose, what led you to climate security as a research interest?
Well, that journey started probably more than 10 years ago. And, my background is as a military historian. I've, studied war and its effects on humanity in all its forms from the earliest time to the present. And when I became more aware of the seriousness of climate change and its potential for, quite harmful effects on humanity, that's, sparked my interest. And being a historian, I did what historians do, and I started reading. And I started reading about how other societies in earlier time periods experienced the climate events that occurred to them, such as the Little Ice Age and also very long droughts that periodically occurred. And in my readings, it became quite clear that whenever a society was in the grip of a climate change event, the outcome was always catastrophic. Without exception, those that experienced a climate change event had an extremely hard time of it. If they were lucky, they survived. And those that survived, it was because of the decisions they made. But some societies just simply disappeared and were erased from from human history. We just know them through their surviving records or their archaeological remains. So anything that is universally catastrophic and which sparks, amongst other things, major wars as people struggle to survive, is of an interest to a military historian. And so then I started looking at the contemporary context and the future potential and trying to understand, what did climate change mean for the future security of Australia and also the survivability of humanity, whether or not humanity would continue on its journey. Now, my place within the Australian Army as a researcher, as the Director of War Studies, I worked in Future Land Warfare Branch, and the remit of Future Land Warfare is actually to look at the future. So I've always been a bit of an unusual historian in that I'm a historian who thinks about where humanity is going and how are we developing and what are the consequences of actions we take today and how they might play out in the future. So I was sort of in the ideal place to think about the future of climate change from an Australian military point of view.
Super interesting. Thanks, Al. And I suppose if we think back even, 10 to 15 years ago, what was the issue like then? in the Australian military and I suppose wider defence sector. It was, I suppose, just coming on the scene politically, perhaps. 2007, we had the so-called
Yes,
climate change election. What was the sense in the military at that particular time?
it was at the very earliest stages of development. Not many people understood it, uh, understood the science or the potential things that the science might result in as climate change effects began to be felt. People certainly understood that that storms and other kind of natural disasters were becoming increasingly likely because of climate change, but nobody really quite understood that this was becoming or would become a national security risk, and that as the military would need to look at it from that point of view. Now, of course, Australia has had several governments that simply didn't want to consider climate change. Either they didn't believe it, or it was just too awkward for them to consider climate change as one of their policies. And so not much was happening. People were learning, people were understanding. The soldiers that I worked with were becoming more cognizant of the issues, but the ability to develop any policy coming from inside the defense organization was simply impossible because the government, signaled quite strongly that the government did not want any policy development in this area. And so the Australian Army and the rest of the Defence Force have been held back for more than a decade. Now, this is starting to change with the change in government, but still it's not the signal that is being given by government is that this isn't the major event that Australia needs to prepare for. So if anyone has had a look at the recently released Defense Strategic Review that Angus Houston and Stephen Smith did, there is a chapter on climate change. It's a page and a half long, but that is remarkable because this is the first time it's happened. The previous strategic update of 2020 just had a few words about it. And before that, it was barely mentioned. So a page and a half is really significant, but this is an 130-page document, and it's clearly not the major issue yet. And we still have a long way to go in defense. But then it's not a major issue for the government and the rest of society either. If government continues to consider fossil fuel initiatives, the opening of new gas fields of fossil fuel, it's clearly not taking it with the seriousness that the matter requires.
I'd just like to sort of, I suppose, get your thoughts on climate security as a definition.
Well, unfortunately, the definition that I would give to national security in a climate context is not the same that you would get from most of the national security community, because most of the people in the national security community are still stuck in a very antiquated way of looking at security as a state versus state thing, in which you prioritize things like deterrence, you prioritize things like your military, and it's a very narrow construct of what security means. And because they have this very narrow construct, it's very hard to get a more vibrant and broader debate going. And I think that's in part why the Defense Strategic Review has only a page and a half on security change, on climate change, because most people in the security community see that as a minor issue compared to the big issue of traditional state on state interactions, security interactions. And it's because of this very narrow definition. And security is ultimately a human issue. It's not a state versus state theoretical construct. it has very practical outcomes for the well-being and survival of people. And whether it's food security or water security or climate security, they all go to the ability of humans to prosper in wherever part of the world where they live. And it goes to the constructing of a society that supports the well-being of the people who belong to it. And so having a security policy that only looks at security to the definition of what another country may or may not do to Australia is not as useful as one that looks at the well-being of society in its totality. Because if you do the more narrow interpretation, the only responses that you are comfortable with generating are those that are look at military responses, the use of force, and either in the offensive or defensive mode. You see other countries as a threat, and then you use the military to counter that threat. Mm-hmm. Whereas a broader definition would allow other narratives about security and would also open the security space to other government departments other than defense. So, foreign affairs, of course, has a role in security and is our way we engage with other nations. But what about all these other departments that exist that also could have, with a broader definition, a role in protecting Australia? And they're not in the game yet. And so that's also something else that needs to change. And first we need to change or get the definition that is used by climate people or people interested in climate change as a security issue, and get that definition out there as opposed to the narrow military one, which is used by traditionalists in the security community.
Yeah. So perhaps in that sense, it's not a bad thing that it's only got a bit part in the Defence Security Review, in the sense that at least it's recognised. It's not saying that by any measure defence is a solution to this. It has a bit role.
Yes, I mean, I was actually astonished that it was in there because it's so unusual, and it is perhaps a sign of progress. But unfortunately, a lot of that chapter, that text on the climate issue or climate responsibility with defense is from a negative point of view, saying that we're not going to be the force of response to domestic disasters unless it's really, really big.
In terms of climate change, I think, conversations you have with people in the street, I'm glad you mentioned the human dimension of this. I think it's something, certainly in an Australian context, most of us have, if not all of us, have experienced, it's a lived experience now. When we look across the Asia Pacific, what are some of and even further afield, what are some of the most pressing climate security risks and challenges that you see right now, but also looking into the future?
Well, I think the most or the largest risk, but is also the most complex and perhaps hardest to mitigate, is the resilience of these societies across this huge territory. Now, Australia has a lot of things in its favor. People. Scientists say we're going to get drier, or that the water will come in greater floods and then longer periods of dry. But Australia does have certain advantages that can allow us to mitigate that. But if you go and you look at somebody who might be living on an atoll like Kiribati in the South Pacific, and the sea levels are rising as they are, you really can't make Kiribati taller, right? There's nothing you can really do there. And at some point, it's going to be submerged. And the same goes for quite a number of these other regional societies. When a big level 5 cyclone comes ashore, and they're going to have to update the scale soon to level 6 and level 7 as these storms grow in power, and cuts a swathe of destruction across several of the Philippine islands, for example, the ability of the Philippines to rebuild the basic infrastructure that supports those communities is going to be very hard pressed. And of course, these things are going to be coming with greater frequency. So before you even fix the previous storm damage, the next one arrives. And so I see that these societies will have lots of pressures on them, and they may not be able to bear that pressure. And the unraveling of these societies may start to commence. And so from a security perspective, a sort of, let's say, national security perspective, the biggest risk that I see is that Australia will be looking to the north and to the northeast, and there will be what they call the emergence of ungoverned spaces. And we're familiar with ungoverned spaces from the Horn of Africa for Somalia, which has been technically an ungoverned space now for 2 decades. But what happens when Papua New Guinea or Fiji or worst case Indonesia falls apart, and you have large parts of that country where there is no longer a central government for Australia to interact with? Who do we support? Who do we help? Who do we help mitigate against these damages, these climate events, when there is no government?
And if you were to look at the sort of, I suppose, range of threats out there at the moment, global threats, of course, we've got the war in Ukraine, we've got, the issue, perceived issue, if you will, in the Taiwan Straits and so forth, and a whole range of other things. Where do you judge it in the scale of, I guess, ultimately, this is what security practitioners and governments are trying to grapple with. Where does this sit in the pantheon of risks and threats that exist out there?
Yes, well, I rate it higher than most. I think, still the number one risk that humanity faces is a nuclear war, a major nuclear war between nuclear powers, because that has the potential to exterminate humanity through either the direct effect of the nuclear explosions or from the ensuing global winter that a major exchange would cause. So, yes, so nuclear exchange is number one, and it could happen quite quickly. It just needs, and if you know your history of the Cold War,
and a tipping point, if you will, as well. You can't.
Once and the history of the Cold War, there were a few occasions. Where there was almost an an accidental potential for an exchange to have occurred, and that would have been the end of it all. But after that, and not that far below it, I rank climate change, because climate change is a global event that will affect all of humanity, whereas something like the war in Ukraine is very unpleasant for those who are involved in that, for the people of Ukraine. I don't want to minimize that, but the rest of us, by and large, can carry on life as we've come to enjoy it. Well, with climate change, as the events worsen and keep coming, as we have increasing temperatures that will cause more powerful storms or longer periods of drought, or when the glaciers continue to melt and the ice of Greenland and Antarctica continue to melt and sea level rises. All these things, when they intersect, the place where they intersect, in my mind, is in food supply. Because a lot of what climate change will do will affect the ability of humanity to intersect or coordinate the growing of food, a man-made human system, with the natural systems that humanity needs and the predictability of what humanity needs. And as food supply drops, and there are many highly vulnerable countries to a loss of food supply because they, at the moment, they don't have the capacity to feed their own people, and they're dependent upon the world market. Now, Australia isn't in that place. Australia is an exporter of food, so that's a good place to be. But many countries aren't, and most of the world's population isn't.
Can you give us a riff, from a military perspective, what are the impacts on the militaries?
Well, in the US, who are far ahead of Australia, or far ahead of the Australian Defense Force, so they provide a better example. Mm-hmm. And most of what they're looking at, well, most of where they're putting their mitigation efforts at the moment is at their base infrastructure. So if you look at Norfolk Naval Station on the east coast of the U.S. in Virginia, it's the most important naval base for the U.S. Navy, and it's very big. And it's obviously at sea level since it's a naval base, but the seas there are rising quite significantly at a faster rate than elsewhere along the East Coast. And they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we keep this base operating when a lot of the low-lying ground is going to go underwater? And another example is up in the Arctic, where the US bases like Thule in Greenland. Their base was built on permafrost, when you could put a concrete runway right down on the permafrost because it made a great foundation, and all the buildings rest on permafrost. And that permafrost is melting, and the base is literally falling apart as buildings sink into the tundra, and the runway cracks and becomes unusable. And Thule, I suspect, is going to have to be abandoned because it's just simply impossible to maintain. And when you look at Australia, we have much fewer bases, and some of them, like RAF base Laverack at Townsville, is not that much above sea level. In fact, some of the taxiways are pretty much at sea level. And as the Coral Sea rises, you'd see Laverack becoming unusable. And also from the Australian perspective, it's fires, massive bushfires. So in the 2019 fires, RAF base, naval base Albatross, down out at Nowra, the members of the base had to start putting out fires because the bushfire was closing in on them. And so these are all factors. But the area where they're not significantly addressing is, what does climate change mean for war? Because that is ultimately the military's business. Mm-hmm. This is why we have them. And this is why we pay soldiers and buy all this equipment, and have this burden upon the state. It's because we keep them around to either prevent other countries from preying on Australia, or to wage war when the government orders the military to do so. And so in that point of view, not a lot is going on, and not a lot in the United States is going on. The listeners may not realize this, but the number one emitter of greenhouse gases in the world is the United States Air Force. So if the United States is going to address climate change, can it do so without also figuring out how to fly planes without emitting greenhouse gases? They're working on it, but the current plane design and technology doesn't seem likely that you're going to be able to get the capability in a modern fighter plane out of one powered by renewable energy. It just doesn't seem likely. And the same thing with the Army has, with its armored fighting vehicles. They're wonderful, powerful pieces of kit, and they're remarkably heavy, and they use a lot of petrol.
I just want to touch on that point you mentioned around, that not much is happening, in relation of climate change and warfare. And I just wanted to sort of get a sense of, how do you design a military, I suppose, to cater for everything?
Yeah, I would respond to that in two ways. In my uh, service to the Australian Army as a civilian, as a public servant in the Department of Defense, I met lots of soldiers and also sailors and aviators, and I never found one who joined, who decided to become a member of the military because what they wanted to do in their service was to evacuate civilians from a flooded town, whether in Australia or overseas. I never came across anybody who thought, I'm going to join the military because I want to push hay bales out of the back of a C-130 so that cattle don't starve to death because the fields are flooded and the farmer can't get to them. Never. They joined because they join the military because they're interested in what the military traditionally does. And many civilians might find this hard to understand. But these are, very, alpha personalities who are risk takers and who enjoy testing their limits. And that's why they joined the military for the traditional military role. So that's point one. And point two is, soldiers, sailors, aviators are really expensive. They're the most, to train them. It's not just the pay, but to train them, to equip them, to maintain them in their health, and to house them, all very expensive. Even for the lowliest private, you're looking at enormous. So from a cost perspective, it doesn't make sense to use your most expensive, government resource to do tasks that are well beneath their level of training. And in fact, one of the problems that the military encountered during the bushfires is that they actually weren't trained to fight fires. So they were just the backup to the SES and other state volunteer community-based disaster responses. But that doesn't mean that there's no solution here. And I've suggested elsewhere that we will eventually need, and sooner rather than later, is a new national organization that is dedicated to disaster response. Now we have the state-based ones, and and they've been doing have been doing a great job for Australia's, for as long as, forever, as far as I know. But their resources are not comparable. State resources are not comparable to what the federal government could deploy. And I'm not saying that the federal government should take over disaster response. That can remain a state-based feature. But for international response, we're going to need a body that can be deployed overseas, and also as a force that could backstop the regional state-based forces and provide the specialized equipment and planning that a state-based organization just can't develop the expertise, particularly when these are volunteer organizations. So I think, and I believe that at some point Australia should look at, and more than look at, just develop a national-based disaster management force with capabilities and with an obligation to be deployed overseas.
So this moves us, I suppose, Al, into the solution space. I suppose if you were the CDF or the secretary or even the prime minister for a day, what would you be sort of, where do you see this heading? What solutions or suggestions or even advice would you give to current day policymakers working in this space?
Well, I tell people that up to a few years ago, we were in a period that you'd call denial at the policy level, where the government just said, it's nothing to look at here. We're not going to do anything. And now we've entered a period of what I would call self-delusion, where the government has enacted some policies, but they're not particularly robust, And whether they do anything at all to reduce emissions is not really known. But it's like the starter policy that we should have had 15 years ago. What we need to now do is our policymakers, our political leaders, have to get out of the self-delusion phase and get into the realistic phase and start mobilizing the population to accept that certain very hard things that are going to have to occur. And amongst this is that fossil fuels are simply going to have to go away. We're going to have to stop emitting fossil fuels at a very rapid rate. Not 30% reduction, not 50% reduction, but 100%. Because the less carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere, the less risk we are at. Now, we're not going to avoid climate change effects. They're already happening, and they're going to get worse. So right now, what we're trying to do is take a bad situation and just keep it bad, not make it catastrophic.
Al, a question I want to ask everyone that comes on the Climate Security podcast: optimist or pessimist?
Well, by nature, I'm a pessimistic kind of guy. And whenever I talk about climate change, one of the things I say, and you'll notice this in my book, is that most climate books, 90% of it is all doom, doom, doom. And then the final chapter, it's all about, hey, if only we do this, everything will be fine. No, I don't think things are going to be fine, because this is the tyranny of the historian. We're not the first people to face this. And we're not the first people to understand what's happening and be able to organize our societies in ways that can contribute to mitigating it. So I don't have the hubris to think that somehow we're exceptional, that we've evolved differently than humanity from 400 years ago, and that what their tragedy won't be repeated by us. So no, I expect us to go through quite a significant amount of pain before we come out the other end. And perhaps that's what we need, because that seems to be the only thing that might get us away from the status quo.
I might mark that down as a pessimistic optimist. Al, how would that?
I fully expect the human promise to continue, but it's going to hurt till we get to that point.
Al, it's been great having you on the show this afternoon, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for having me.